Ecological succession. Here are your learning goals. Explain the difference between primary and secondary succession and use the terms pioneer species and climax community. Describe the events in aquatic succession using the terms lake, wetland, meadow, terrestrial, climax community. Succession is the orderly natural changes and species replacement that takes place in a community of an ecosystem. What that means is that some species are going to replace others in the community of an ecosystem if there's a disruption. The first species to move into a barren area is called a pioneer species. And the climax community is a stable, mature community that undergoes little or no change. The type of climax community that's going to occur when there's succession depends on what kind of community should be there. If we have succession here in Virginia, the climax community is going to be a hardwood forest. If we had succession that occurred in the tropical rainforest, then the climax community would be a stable, mature tropical rainforest. The first type of succession that we're going to talk about is called primary succession. And that's when you have bare land that's colonized and becomes a climax community. Primary succession starts with bare rock. There is no community there. There are no living things there. It starts with just bare rock. And it goes through some predictable stages. The first stage would be moss and lichens will grow on the rocks. They're going to die. When they decompose, their remains are going to mix with rock dust. And eventually they're going to produce soil. Once there's soil, then you're going to be able to get grasses, flowers, eventually shrubs, then some trees. These first trees may not be the trees that you see in the climax community, but you'll get trees, and then eventually this would be the climax community. So primary succession is when you start with nothing. There was nothing living there at the time. There was just bare rock. Now, some people don't understand what lichens are. Lichens are these crusty looking things that you see on rocks. And these are actually living things. These are a combination of fungus and algae. And then these are some mosses that are growing on the rock. So this would be the first thing that would move into a barren area where there was no existing community, where you had bare rock. When these die, their decomposed parts are going to mix with rock dust and start to form soil. Once you get soil, then you can get other plants. Let's look at some examples of primary succession. This is in Canada, and this is the Athabasca Glacier. Now, in the early 1800s, when Europeans first came to this area, this glacier completely filled this valley up to this area here and past where these cars are parked. Now this glacier is huge and it's a long way from here. It's been slowly melting back over the last 150 or 200 years. Here's a view closer up to the glacier, and to give you an idea of how big it is, these little dots here are people that are walking on the glacier. Here's some people that are about halfway between us and them. So this is an enormous, enormous glacier. As it's been melting back, the Park Service has placed these markers for where the glacier was in different years. So in the year 2000, the glacier ended here. It's melted back quite a ways since then in the last 14 years. And if you look down, what's left behind when the glacier disappears is bare rock. There's nothing living here. It's been scraped clean of living things and soil. Here's a marker for where the glacier ended in 1982. So this was a little over 30 years ago. Now if you look down, what do you begin to see? That's right. There's some moss growing here. This is one of the pioneer species in this area. And where the moss has been growing for a while and dying and decaying and building up some organic matter, then you're beginning to get flowers. And here's where the glacier was in 1948, and look behind this marker. Now you've got grasses, you've got little shrubs that are growing over here, and lo and behold, a tiny little tree. So this is primary succession. We started with bare rock, and now we have a pretty thriving community. Here's another example. This is Mount St. Helens in Washington. And in the 1980s, it erupted very explosively and destructively. This is what Mount St. Helens looked like from Spirit Lake in 1963. And this is the same view from Spirit Lake after the eruption. It blew the top third of the mountain away. And when it did that, it caused tremendous destruction in the path of the explosion and eruption. And those areas were covered with layers of ash and rock. So this at one point, right before the eruption, was a beautiful forest. And now it's nothing but a pile of rocks. Well, here's some pictures that were taken after the eruption. This was taken several years later, and look what's happened. We've got pioneer species moving into the area. They're going to start building up soil, and eventually this area will become forested. As you can see in this lower picture now, there's trees growing here, and eventually it's going to look like this again. That's primary succession because we started with bare rock. All right, so hit pause, answer these questions, and then hit play. So what is primary succession? Primary succession is an orderly series of species that move into an area and eventually convert bare rock into a climax community. What do we call the first species to move into an area where there was previously no life? We call that a pioneer species. And what are some places where we might see primary succession? Well, like we said, when glaciers recede, after a volcanic eruption, new volcanic islands that are born and arise above the surface of the ocean. They're bare rock, but eventually they become colonized by life. Secondary succession is similar but a little bit different, because in secondary succession there's already a community of life that existed in the area. There's already soil, and there were already a community of living things, but something disrupts that existing community. The classic example shown in this picture would be a farm field. Around here, all the land was covered by forest. Farmers cut down the trees and pulled up the stumps and created farm fields. But if you quit farming, quit plowing, eventually it turns back into forest. And that's secondary succession. There's already dirt there. There was a community, and you've disturbed it but haven't completely destroyed it. So here we would start with weeds, grasses, and then we would get some shrubs and then some trees, and eventually those trees would be replaced by the climax community. And again, the climax community would depend on what biome you were in. In Northern Virginia, this climax community is going to be a deciduous hardwood forest. If you were in the tundra, then this would be tundra instead of trees. If you were in the tropical rainforest, instead of the types of trees we have around here, you would have tropical rainforest trees. So here's a great example of secondary succession. This is Yellowstone National Park, and in the 90s there were some huge fires there. And this is showing the fire behind and approaching some of the historic buildings there on the park. Well, eventually the fires were put out, and what you were left with was bare ground. The trees, the grasses, and everything had been killed. But here's a pioneer species, fireweed. It's one of the first plants that moves into an area where there's been a fire. There's already soil there, and this is the first plant that moves in. After the fireweed, after a season or two, then you get grasses, you get flowers, and eventually you get new trees move into the area. This is a picture that I took in 2010, and these pine trees, which are the climax community for that area, are about 6 feet tall at this point. By the time you guys are my age, this will be a forest just like it was before. So hit pause, answer these questions, and when you're ready, hit play. What is secondary succession? Secondary succession occurs when an existing community is disrupted. Say a forest that's cut down and turned into a farm field, and then you let the farm field go back to nature. Succession will change it from a grassy field into a forest in this area. What do we call the first species to move into a disturbed area? Same as before, a pioneer species. And what are some places we might see secondary succession? Well, the classic example is a farm field that's left to go back to nature. Areas after a fire, those are classic examples. The last type of succession we want to talk about is aquatic succession. And that's where an aquatic community is converted into a terrestrial climax community. So we would start with a newly formed lake. Say the glaciers retreated, they'd carved this depression in the ground, and it filled with water and created this new lake. Over time, streams feeding into the lake would bring in sediment, sand, silt, mud, and the lake would begin to fill up. Also, aquatic plants would die and fall to the bottom, and so you would build up a type of soil, mud, at the bottom of the lake. The lake would gradually get shallower and shallower and would start to get dry along the edges. As it starts to dry and the water becomes very shallow, then you get marshy plants that move into this soggy soil. They help dry it out. The lake continues to get smaller due to sediment moving in and organic debris left over from dead plants helping to fill it up. And eventually, plants would grow all across what was once a lake. And as this lake gets drier and drier and turns from a marshy area into dry soil, then the forest is going to move in from both sides. And eventually you would have a hard time telling that there was ever a lake there. So we start with a newly formed lake, we get a mature lake, then we get a marsh and a meadow, because along the edges here you would get grasses between the marsh plants and the trees. That would be the meadow, this would be the marsh, and eventually dry land.